In this video, we're going to be looking at what is meant by the budgetary policy stance. And this is probably the first video that we haven't covered yet in class. So the budgetary policy stance is basically referring to what the desired impact of that budget is on the economy. So do what they want the budget to have an expansionary impact on the economy? Do they want it to have a contractionary impact on the economy, or will the budget have a fairly neutral impact on the economy? So a big part of the exam is you analysing the 2015-2016 budget and what the desired stance of the government was. Were they trying to stimulate the economy? Were they trying to slow the economy down? Was their main goal to try and reduce our debt? What was the stance of the current budget, or the desired impact of the current budget? So a balanced budget is generally considered to be relatively neutral. Okay, they're basically injecting back into the economy the same amount they are taking out, so it's not really expanding or contracting the level of economic activity. A deficit is the different. A deficit is when they're injecting more into the economy than they're leaking. So the government is spending more money than they are receiving, and that the idea of budget deficit is to expand the economy. So the bigger the budget deficit, the more expansionary impact it's going to have on our economy. The smaller the deficit or higher the surplus, the more contractionary the budget is. A budget surplus is when the government is taking out more from the economy than is injecting. So leakages are outweighing injections. And when I use the term leakages, I mean generally taxes, and injections are government spending. So welfare, infrastructure spending, anything like that is in a form of injection. So when we run a budget surplus, it is contracting economic activity because the government's taking more away from the economy than they're putting back into it. So that might be as a result of higher taxes, less spending on infrastructure. All of these things will reduce the components of aggregate demand, whether it be C, I, G1, G2, and slow the level of economic activity. So it's the size of the surplus or the deficit we're looking at to determine whether a budget is contractionary or expansionary. So if the government runs a bigger surplus or a smaller deficit than the year before, it is generally called a more contractionary budget. So the bigger the surplus or smaller the deficit would be a contractionary budget. So if the surplus goes from 10 million to 15 million, it would be considered contractionary. If the surplus went from 15 million to 10 million, or in this case here from 10 million to 5 million, we would consider that a more expansionary budget. So if the size of the surplus falls, it's a more expansionary budget. If the size of the deficit increases, it would be a more expansionary budget. If the size of the deficit decreases, it would be a more contractionary budget. So if the deficit goes from $50 billion to $20 billion, that would be considered to have a relatively contractionary effect. So let's have a look at the budgets from 2014-2015 to 2015-2016. Again, an exam question from last year. Comparing the estimates of 2014-2015 with 2015-2016, describe the change in the stance of budgetary policy between the 2 years. So what's the stance from this one period to the next period? So as you can see, the underlying cash balance, which is generally what we quote, has fallen from $41 billion to $35 billion. Okay, only talk about the years they want you to talk about. If you talk about this year, I don't care. That's there to put you off. Don't talk about it. It's not relevant. Answer the question that they're asking you. And they're asking you from 2014 to 2015 to 2015-2016. This stuff here, okay, no, you don't get bonus marks for talking about it. It's not relevant to the question. They don't want you to talk about it there. It's there as an outlier. Only talk about these two figures here. Okay? That idea of reading tables, reading them accurately, using the right information is really important. So, how would we talk about the change? Well, it's clearly a more contractionary budget because the size of the deficit has fallen, and the size of the deficit as a percentage of GDP has also fallen. So, if we're comparing the budget stance, we would say the budget deficit is expected to fall from a deficit of $41.1 billion to a deficit of $35.1 billion in 2015-2016. As measured by the underlying cash balance, it will also represent a smaller percentage of GDP from 2.6% to 2.1%. First paragraph is basically analysing the figures, analysing the data. Again, use the figures. They've given you the figures. They've made it easy for you. Use what they're saying or you won't get the marks. Explain what's happened. They've explained what's happening here. They've explained it as a percentage of GDP. Really clearly articulate what's happening with these figures. Don't just say it's falling. Okay, you're not answering the question. Talk about what the actual data represents and use the figures they're giving you. It's easier if you use the figures. They're there for you. You just got to use them. So, The first paragraph is explaining what's happening with the figures. The second paragraph is explaining whether it's contractionary or expansionary. So this is generally seen as a contractionary stance when comparing the 15-16 budget to 14-15. This is because in order to reduce the deficit, the government will have to reduce government spending and or raise taxes, which is likely to have a dampening effect on aggregate demand. So it's basically saying because the deficit is smaller, it's contractionary, and explaining why it's contractionary compared to last year. So in order for it to be smaller, the government may have had to raise taxes, or they may have had to slow spending, or it may have happened naturally because the economy, was in a stronger period of growth. But it's clearly showing it's contractionary. It's clearly using the numbers to articulate that for your 2 marks. Next video, budget stance part.